Hey, Peter, thank you for joining me for this conversation. And just to get things started, you have identified yourself as, at least in the past, you've identified yourself as a Satanist transhumanist. And I identify myself as a Christian. I wouldn't necessarily identify myself as a Christian transhumanist because, as C.S. Lewis noted, it might be best to avoid hyphenated Christianity. But I am definitely a Christian who is cheering for the transhumanists. I would say I'm on the same side as the transhumanists because they are against death and Christianity is against death. So I believe these two viewpoints are simpatico. So this conversation will be interesting. I think it'll be interesting because ostensibly it's going to be a debate between a Christian transhumanist and a Satanist transhumanist. I actually am a Christian who believes in a literal interpretation of the King James Bible. And so this should be an interesting clash of ideologies. So before we start, maybe just to recap for the readers, how and why did you decide to embrace this idea of Satanist transhumanism?
I don't necessarily walk around thinking I don't hold this as a super strong label of satanic or Satanist transhumanism. Just to take them in parts first, the transhumanism, that especially I do feel is pretty inevitable where, just naturally as technology and science progress, I think that we are just going to merge at some level with machines by, with maybe Neuralink or something like that. And also we're just going to continue to augment our bodies to fight diseases, to have better eyesight, maybe to be smarter. If you play out the next, couple hundred years of humanity, there's almost no scenario in which we don't augment our bodies with technology and with the powers of biotech. So I think that just kind of going along with that and discussing the parameters of that is enough for someone to consider themselves a transhumanist and to participate in that dialogue. That's kind of where I'm at with that movement. And also, I just think that there's a lot of very colorful characters who are involved in the transhumanist movement. Zoltan Istvan, who's ran for president a few times in the Transhumanist Party, which he created. There's also Josiah Zayner, the biohacker guy who's now in Austin, doing a lot of fascinating things. The movement itself seems really fresh and kind of innovative, which I like. In terms of Satanism, I grew up a Christian, so a lot of the Christian symbology that just exists in our culture, it does kind of resonate with me. So just like the idea of, the old story in Genesis with, Satan in the tree of knowledge, defying God and, giving knowledge to humans. That story, when you kind of like look at it from a different lens, a more modern lens about how God in that story is essentially the tyrant and Satan is the savior. The word Lucifer actually means light bringer. Satan allowed humans to question the tyrant and to find knowledge and seek meaning and understanding on our own terms. And that's the Enlightenment. That's like America, to me, the whole Genesis thing, it's all obviously like allegory. So there are different ways to interpret it. That to me is like a perfectly justifiable and maybe even the best interpretation from a modern reader's perspective. That gets me a little bit just on board with the symbolism of Satanism as Satan as the light bringer character. If you tie those two things together, where you have like Satan, who's this figure of you own your own destiny and you have the power to find knowledge and to create the world as you see fit, along with transhumanism, which is, our bodies aren't sacred. They're things to be manipulated and to be augmented. Those two concepts go together very naturally, and I think that they do form a fairly coherent worldview, and that's kind of where I'm at.
Okay, and I think that's interesting. I was listening to the podcast that you did with Sacred Tension, and I thought it was a fascinating conversation you guys were having. And one of the things you mentioned in the podcast, you were talking about the devil as a literary figure, because so much of what we think about when we talk about the devil, it's not actually from the Bible. So much of it was shaped through literary sources. John Milton in Paradise Lost, Dante in the Divine Comedy. And those are the two primary guys who helped shape the mythology of Satan. But if you just look at the biblical text, the King James Bible, the story of Satan once being an angel is not actually in there. The idea that Satan is the snake in the Garden of Eden is not in there. The story of Lucifer rebelling, like you're mentioning, that story of Lucifer rebelling and transforming into Satan is not in the Bible. But of course, John Milton didn't invent that depiction of the devil. Dante didn't invent that, but they both helped to promote this view of the devil. A lot of the stuff was taken from extra canonical books like the various books of Enoch. But again, none of that is in the official King James Bible. So would you agree with that? Like, would you agree that most of the traditional views of Satan are from literary and extra biblical sources? And how would they inform your view of the devil?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. One thing that's actually very interesting about the Bible is how infrequently any concept like the devil or Satan shows up. It's almost as if the main protagonist, the main antagonist, like barely has any sort of a starring role. It's almost like bizarre how absent that figure is. And then, if you fast forward, a couple thousand years where you have someone like C.S. Lewis writing the Screw Tape Letters, you do have a lot of cultural, traditions, a lot of other texts, a lot of, just people's imaginations running wild with this in terms of like paintings and books and movies. All of that, informs our view of who this character is. Because, I mean, even the Bible itself, I think, my view is that it's all pretty much a literary document. Most of it is not terribly historical, not terribly accurate. But it's a brilliant, and fascinating literary work. If nothing else, obviously other people see it as more than that. And now, if I were just to carry it forward from like what C.S. Lewis did to today's, contemporary reading, where all of that history, I think it's pretty fair to look back at all of that and to read into those original stories and to see the God figure again as kind of like the tyrant, and the Satan figure as kind of like the hero of the story, who's bringing light to humanity. This also, incidentally, some of these concepts kind of predate Christianity. There's like Zoroaster, the religion in the Middle East that predated Christianity. They also had this concept of humanity controls its own destiny. God is kind of hands off, and we get to determine how we view our bodies, how we view morality, how we view our place in the cosmos. And then you see that crop up in Greek mythology as well, with Prometheus, who steals fire from the gods and then runs with technology on his own terms. So that Satan figure also very, very long history, even outside of the Christian context, I think.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting perspective, and obviously my perspective is different. And my perspective is as far as like Christianity and transhumanism being the things that maybe I'll explain how I think that the Christian view is compatible with transhumanism. The number one thing to me is the fact that the Bible has accurately predicted some major things that only now seem credible, like things that seemed impossible until this moment in history. And one of the things that's very interesting to me is that multiple scientists and researchers, like Zoltan Istvan, who you mentioned a couple times there, Richard Dawkins, David Deutsch, Frank Tipler, Max Tegmark, and many others are now predicting that we may be able to raise the dead through, like Zoltan Istvan has the quantum archaeology theory.
Right.
And then you have simulation theory, Frank Tipler, Nick Bostrom's simulation theory. In fact, the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, believes that we are already computer simulations, the quantum archaeology proposal, as proposed by Zoltan Istvan, can serve as a possible mechanism for non-virtual physical resurrection. And there's many other, similar transhumanist proposals which would seem like they may be fulfilling biblical predictions. Like Corinthians 15:51 tells us, listen, I tell you a mystery, we will not all sleep, but we will be changed in the flash, in the twinkling of an eye. And at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will all be changed. And there's countless other biblical passages which suggest that the sleeping and the long departed will be raised up in the far future, and that it will be a physical resurrection here in the physical universe. And the stuff about the physical resurrection in the far future has almost been ignored by the Christian church, because they have been I think the way Christians perceive it is they're like, well, everyone goes to heaven when they die. Why do they need to be yanked out of heaven and pulled back to earth for a resurrection? But this idea of a physical resurrection is a consistent and constantly recurring topic in the Bible, even starting in the Old Testament, continuing through all the way to the book of Revelation. And so the way I perceive it, it seems like for the first time in history, these predictions make sense, from a scientific perspective. Because I look at like Zoltan Istvan's series and Frank Tipler's series, and I'm like, well, that's what the Bible was talking about. It's saying we're going to be literally resurrected in our future. So I'm going back and saying, let's look at the Bible literally. And so let me ask you, as someone who is taking part of the biblical story seriously, the story of Satan, can you take some of these other aspects seriously? Do these predictions that there will be resurrections in the far future, could these, in your mind, be accurate predictions of biotechnological advancements in the far future?
Yeah, I think that probably at this point is the most compelling way to keep Christianity relevant. Because I really do. I think that's it adds a lot of color and a lot of beauty and literary qualities to the idea of the transhumanist conception of humans living forever. Because part of my whole perspective on life, humanity, these things is that we live our lives through narratives, through stories, and life becomes meaningful and beautiful when you're able to layer on some kind of flowery poetic language. And the Christian tradition is one reason that I think it sticks around, is that a lot of the imagery is just so beautiful. It really is very compelling. This is why you turn on a Bob Dylan song or a Leonard Cohen song, and their songs they seem timeless because they so easily reference concepts from the Bible that are very rich with meaning. And so that is something that what you talked about there with Christianity. I wouldn't say it predicted these things. I think that in a more, this is again, sorry, my bitter atheist perspective is the view that I think that the human mind just kind of naturally creates these forward-thinking fantasies. I think that outside of Christianity, if you look at other world religions, if you look at Native American traditions, or what's going on like the Aztecs, or a lot of people across the world, literally across time, they all had some conception of living forever, and maybe the body's sacred, maybe it's not, but there's something special about consciousness. There's something immortal about this this soul thing, which is this immaterial thing. That's definitely not unique to Christianity, but Christianity does have very, again, really, really beautiful poetic perspective on that view, and I think that is really valuable to. So let's just kind of say if you're someone like me, or if you're someone who's maybe nothing about Christianity, right? But you're a very strong proponent of transhumanist conceptions. You may not know how to place transhumanist ideas merging with machines, or your body living forever, or archaeology of the dead. Some of these concepts, you may not know what to do with them in terms of life's meaning, in terms of how you relate to them as a human, unless you have some sort of cultural layering on top of that to put a narrative onto it. And Christianity has a lot of that kind of built in, where you're able to make it, quote unquote, make sense by just having some kind of colorful poetry to slip in there on top of it. I'm not sure how you feel about that kind of atheist perspective, do you think that that's still valuable at all, or do you find that just to be kind of nonsense?
Well, no, I think what you're saying is, I think there's, even if Christianity isn't true literally, then at the very least, it's like a context in which you can explain life and kind of pull together all these different concepts and ideas and explain life to maybe, shall we say, people not quite as intelligent. I mean, that's one way to put it, but yeah, at the very least, that's what religion does, is you can contextualize things. Like, I don't expect, like, white trash people living in a trailer court to try to understand the intricacies of quantum theory and stuff. But you can kind of explain this. These things can kind of be explained if you say, well, let's put it in this context. You know these things about the Bible. You've heard about resurrection and all this. And so it's, I would say religion at the very least is that, explaining ethics, explaining why resurrecting the dead would be important. Like, a lot of people will say, like, we don't need to resurrect the dead. Well, that's an interesting objection, but, 2,000 years of Christian teachings have said that the most important event in human history was a person literally being resurrected, physically being resurrected from the dead.
Right.
So, I can respond to that, to those kind of arguments. The kind of arguments that people make against transhumanism, I think Christianity has given me a built-in response for almost every single argument. I do. The more I study this, the more I start thinking. I mean, maybe I'm crazy, but the more I start thinking that there really is, the Bible literally is true. Going back to that podcast that you did, the Sacred Tensions podcast, one thing that was really fascinating to me, you were talking about how you know who is the good guy and who's the bad guy. And that was interesting to me because I'm also usually drawn to the villains in a story. And I think that's why I was kind of drawn to Donald Trump. And I think that's why, even though Christians don't want to admit it, they're drawn to the dark side. Like, Donald Trump is this guy. He's this guy who Christians don't want to admit, but he's a serial adulterer. He appeared in 3 porno films. He said he'd never asked God for forgiveness. He grabs women by the genitals without permission. And my community's embrace of Donald Trump is clearly an embrace of the dark side, and I can totally relate to that on some level. But I get that embrace of the dark side. I'm definitely not a Satanist, but like, there are several Satanist metal bands I've listened to. I'm drawn to the dark side as a goth. Like, I was a goth growing up, and that's kind of like the dark side for Christian kids, because you get to wear crosses and listen to, like, Personal Jesus by Depeche Mode and stuff. and I think goth is kind of like a Christian subgenre in that way. But but not to get too far off topic, but actually, just, I'm curious, is there any kind of goth transhumanist community that you're aware of?
Kind of no, although I kind of guarantee it's out there someplace. I did actually last night Google satanic transhumanism to see what popped up. There is some sort of a work out there, I forget what it's called, but there's some book out there where someone wants to destroy all culture, all music, all everything, and kind of rebuild it from scratch or something like this. And it seemed to have some sort of maybe a goth element to it. It's kind of like very anarchistic. But, I feel like it's definitely inevitable. I'm maybe just not tapped into that world.
That's interesting. I don't know. The reason I was asking is because it seems like, because of the fact that Goths are lamenting the horror of death, it seems like they would be the first ones to celebrate, when a solution to death is being offered. And, and I see transhumanism as the solution to that existential kind of thing, what I was worried about as a kid, that obsession with death. And so it seems like, as much as like Goths complain about death, and rightfully so, they should be just as loud and as vocal when a potential solution comes along. But anyways, not to get too far off topic, but at any rate, I am definitely drawn to the dark side. I can definitely relate to that. But I can read a book by, like, the Marquis de Sade and find it very compelling. But at the same time, as a transhumanist, I'm like, I'm thinking we cannot allow the dark side to take over. I asked myself, what kind of a simulated reality would the Marquis de Sade create? Because sexual libertinism is well and good, but where does that lead to on a societal level? If someone like the Marquis de Sade is, turned on by tearing women's teeth out with pliers and, different are when Miwas is turned on by cooking and eating his homosexual lover. Well, that kind of stuff starts sounding pretty similar to hell to me. And I would personally rather have someone like Joel Osteen in charge of my simulated reality. On a societal level, I'm still drawn to the traditional good guys, and to me that kind of means traditional Christianity. But how would you respond to that argument? Like, even if you admire transgressive culture, do you really want that culture to be the dominant force?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. I think that my response to that is, because I've read Desaad, really enjoyed his novels. A lot of that does kind of appeal to me too, and I think that a lot of that is harmless and fine and has its own kind of beauty to it. Going back a little bit to Donald Trump and how you said that Christians have maybe embraced the dark side by embracing Donald Trump. To me, the problem is not the fact that he has some of these maybe immoral, amoral characteristics, like he's been divorced a few times and he's had extramarital affairs and been in porno films, and like kind of those things just make him interesting and just make him almost kind of like the celebrity figure that you expect him to be, in a sense, just like by his looks and his that sort of thing. What's scary and dangerous about him to me is, this is just speaking, I guess, as a liberal who was never drawn to him, but it's his like extreme narcissism. It's his extreme tendencies towards power at all costs, to denying reality at all costs just to make things fit his reality. Those things are the subversive, scary things that I think lead to a potential like evil tyrant figure who, I just don't think that he understands, a lot about the American legal system, what's lawful, what's not, like very, very, very basic things, like maybe marriage isn't sacred, but sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was just saying, and that goes hand in hand with conspiracy theories that he's completely he's made mainstream within the Republican Party, and that's what's especially to me the problem is that I'm a conservative. I'm conservative in every as conservative as you can get, but the problem is when you're so disconnected from reality that you embrace a conspiracy theory, and it goes along with. You mentioned the narcissism. He refuses to admit he lost the election, so all he has to do is come up with a conspiracy theory that says he won the election, and he knows that 70 million voters are going to go along with it. If we're looking at, if we're so divorced from reality that 70 million people are saying he won the election, even though the Supreme Court and like 60 different courts have all looked at the evidence and said he didn't win, then we're really making a big mistake. It's the quote, "The truth shall set you free," is from the Bible, and Christians do not seem to have any interest in the truth. I mean, hopefully it's just a phase. Hopefully this won't last.
Yeah, just one more note there. One thing that's really interesting. This is I gravitate towards this kind of response. Just my first love is fiction, so I'm a novelist. That's kind of what I do. More than I kind of write, nonfiction on the side, but I spend quite a bit more time writing fiction. So just in terms of like crafting a great evil character, a lot of times the best bad guys, they don't have hang-ups like multiple divorces or like you've been in smut films or like kind of like easy stuff that like makes you kind of a bad guy. A lot of times they're great, great looking on the outside characters, but they also have these tendencies that harm others. And so, maybe just to bring it to history a little bit, I imagine some of maybe like the Stasi guards in Germany, they probably had great, healthy, happy marriages, but they were terrorizing the public. You know what I mean? Those are the real like villains in society, I think. So, again, this is kind of like the liberal response, but liberals are really we're not that scared of Donald Trump. We all think that he's going to self-destruct or die, and he's going to be impossible to replace because he's such a cult of personality. What's really the fear is someone who is like the package deal where they are a great politician, they don't have any marital problems or other of these kind of aesthetic hangups that moral hangups that Donald Trump has, but they're also a very effective politician at doing things that liberals would say are like scary to democracy and to rights or whatever. So we look at like someone like Ron DeSantis as maybe the more scary, evil, quote unquote, evil figure than Donald Trump. And that to me is just kind of interesting in terms of, again, bringing it back to like Satanism, that sort of a thing, how sometimes the good guys are not what they seem, sometimes the bad guys are not what they seem, and really like digging into that is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And actually, that makes me think of one other question, which I probably shouldn't ask. My boss at the website specifically said, don't get into too much politics. But it makes me think of one other question, because one thing that does kind of surprise me is that most of the transhumanist like movers and shakers, as far as it applies to politics, seem to be Republicans for some reason. Because like I was saying, I am a hardcore conservative. I ran the Great Falls, Montana Republican field office. And so I'm about as right-wing as it gets, and I am a transhumanist, but it surprises me because on my side of the aisle, we also have Peter Thiel, who's like the most powerful guy in the new right movement. We have Elon Musk, and even our friend Zoltan Istvan ran as a Republican.
Right.
And Frank Tipler used to write for the right-wing PJ Media website. Like Ross Douthat has more or less embraced transhumanism. So all these guys I kind of look up to are hardcore right-wingers, but the true believers are from the Christian transhumanist community. I mean, that's kind of how it seems to me, but I'd kind of like to hear your perspective on that.
I think that the vein that connects a lot of those figures is probably some sense of libertarianism, a little bit of live and let live, do what you will, that sort of a thing, which those folks do definitely right now in American politics gravitate toward the right, I think, just because, I mean, the left is very scoldy right now, and I think that kind of scares off a lot of libertarian type folks. I guess I have a couple other just thoughts there. One is that, like, if you get into the psychology of a liberal versus a conservative, Jonathan Haidt has a really great TED Talk on this about people who are traditionally conservative. They have a lot of like a very like an ick response to things that's heightened. You're less likely to try unusual foods. You're less likely to engage with travelers. You're less likely to want foreigners into your country because there's this kind of like ick of the unknown. Whereas a liberal is more like, oh, that's interesting, let me try that, or I want to go traveling, or oh, I love newcomers, I love people who don't look like me. There's like a biological element to this, right? And I think that, like, weirdly, American politics doesn't map onto that too coherently anymore, although it kind of used to. But I mean, I see a lot of these people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Zoltan. These folks, I think that they're cosmopolitans, above and beyond all else. They're like capitalists and cosmopolitans, and they're very, very, very liberal. If you look at like most people around the world who like maybe don't travel 100 miles from the place they were born, oftentimes, these guys are like hyper liberal. I'm sure they try new foods all the time. I'm sure they have like many affairs with lots of, they don't have an ick response. They are like biologically liberal people. So that is kind of weird just in terms of American politics. The left is a little stifling right now. They're a little, nanny state-y. That turns people off like that a little bit. So yeah, I just think it's messy. Like right now, that's kind of my analysis. It's all very messy right now. Although maybe one last thought here, just to wrap up, is that I think that almost everyone is kind of low-key a transhumanist in the sense that we all are in general okay with modern medicine. We're all in general okay with some sort of maybe a brain implant if it helps a quadriplegic. We're all sort of okay with bioengineering as long as it maybe doesn't mess with stem cells. Like, in broad strokes, I think almost everyone in modern society is on board with the basic thing of technology good, science and medicine good. Let's make less people suffer from ailments, and that's like kind of bare bones transhumanism to me. And I think almost everyone's somewhat on board there.
Well, I would think so, but there's a lot of conspiracy theorists who do not the idea of a brain chip and stuff. But what's interesting about that is those same conspiracy theorists that have, talk about the reptilian agenda and the David Icke stuff. Alex Jones and these guys. Steve Quayle is another big one. I don't know. Do you know who Steve Quayle is by chance?
I don't actually.
Okay. He has something online about transhumanism opening up the gates of hell. And one thing that's interesting is that Elon Musk is these guys' favorite person right now because he's really appealing to the right wing, and he's really kind of a savior in this idea that he can just swoop in and buy Twitter and I love Elon Musk too. But what's interesting is he's literally working on a brain chip, and a lot of the conspiracy theorists don't seem to have a problem with that. Is your recorder, are you good to go?
I'm good to go now, yeah.
Nice. Okay, yeah, sorry to go off on that tangent about politics. Let me get back to the regular questions again here. Just quickly revisit just the idea of the devil. As we were saying earlier, despite what most Christians believe, there is no origin story for the devil in the Bible. And so if you look at just the King James Bible, we actually see a surprisingly consistent narrative. Satan first appears in the book of Job. And weirdly, the first bit of conversation involving Satan is God saying something to the effect of, "Where did you come from?" And so if someone's looking for kind of like a meta-narrative, they might be kind of interested in that passage. But Satan first appears in Job as an accuser of men, like a guy who can access heaven. And he tells God that he's been walking back and forth between earth and heaven. And then in Revelation 12, it talks about there being a war in heaven that's happening concurrently with the time that Christ was on earth, like kind of around 6 BC or thereabouts. And that is, according to Revelation, is when Satan and his angels are actually cast out of heaven. And then, it mentions in that passage that Satan loses his ability to accuse men, which ties back to his first appearance in Job. And then all that kind of ties into Luke 10:8, where Christ says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from the sky." And so it's like we're seeing that told, the same story of Revelations 12 told from Christ's perspective while he's on earth. And so this all is like really interestingly consistent to me, like how everything ties in when you realize the story of Lucifer's fall isn't in the Bible. Because then it doesn't quite make sense, because if Lucifer is cast out of heaven before the dawn of time, before the story of Adam and Eve, then why is he back up in heaven in Job, and why is he back up in heaven in Revelation? So anyways, I take all this literally. This is kind of a loaded question, so I'll narrow it down a bit. In that Sacred Tension podcast, I heard you talking about the serpent in the garden and how you have a different perspective about the serpent's interaction with Eve. And you were mentioning that a few minutes ago also. But do you believe there is and I think I know the answer to this, but do you believe there was a literal interaction between a woman named Eve and a talking serpent? Or do you perceive this to be like an interesting myth that may have some, that may be useful to humans in some way, in the way that various myths and stories have carried meaning for the human race?
When I was younger, I grew up Christian, and the only way the Bible made sense to me, maybe this was just because I was young, I don't know, but was to take everything very literally. So I used to, be 6-day or 6,000-year-old creationist, that sort of a thing, young Earth creationist, I guess they're called. I took everything very, very, very literally, and it was kind of fun to believe that, because the whole cosmos makes sense, right? Like everything makes sense. So there are no questions. Everything is part of that one singular narrative. Nothing's messy. It's all right there. Now, and I always kind of felt back then that if it's not literal, it just doesn't make sense, and so the whole thing falls apart, because there are just it's either kind of poetry or not. In my mind, I just understood it as that. I ended up obviously not falling out of Christianity, and now I see the thing just as another story that humans have told. And there's thousands and thousands of creation myths. I used to believe that the Genesis narrative was really unique and special and on and on. Now I see that it's actually not that interesting. I think that there are others that are just more colorful. And the Genesis narrative doesn't even make sense, really. Like it's fairly incoherent. It's almost weird that it stuck around in its form. So I have a hard time like really reading too much into it. But like I do like the idea that the handed down story is that God is all powerful and created all of life, and he's a good guy. And Satan, or the serpent in that story, I'm actually, I'll pause there for 1 second. Who do you think the serpent was, if not Satan?
Okay, yeah, that's interesting, because the Bible actually doesn't say, I mean, obviously we have Christian tradition has totally connected Satan to the snake. But I'm under the impression it's possible that it was just a snake communicating. Because the Bible says then all snakes get punished. Your ancestors will be, that other snakes would have to crawl around on their stomach for the rest of their days as punishment. And if that was just the devil disguised as a snake, why would the rest of the snakes be punished for that? So I think it's implicit in the story that it wasn't necessarily Satan, that it was a snake, and then that got attached. And there's no passage in the Bible that makes that connection. That's just something that was added on later, and I'm not exactly sure where that came from. But, I mean, I know the parts about Lucifer falling is really indebted, from what I understand, that's indebted to one of the books of Enoch, and then, further developed by Milton and Dante. Angels are cast out of heaven in that passage in Revelation, but it talks about it, I mean, like, even a cursory reading, you can pin that down. It's happening while Christ is on earth, because it talks about Christ being born, and that the war in heaven takes place at the coming of Christ, when he changes the status quo and everything. So the thing about Enoch is that Enoch also, he actually, in the extra biblical book, this is not part of the Bible, even though Enoch is a character in the Bible, the books that are attributed to him are not part of the King James Bible. And he's got some really wild stuff. And he says there's multiple falls where Satan maybe tempts or gets more of the angels to be on his side, and there's multiple, he rises, ascends to heaven, and falls multiple times. And so he kind of tries to make it all more coherent. But it's, I mean, and then there's things like, people always ask me, well, how can you possibly believe in Genesis when you believe in evolution? Because I believe I am completely pro-science. I would never in a million years say Darwinism isn't true or any of that. But I believe that if you read Genesis, it's kind of hard to explain this. I don't want to get too far off tangent, but I believe that evolution is implicit in the story of Adam and Eve, because I don't know. Do you want to hear why, or maybe?
Maybe you could answer a question for me to jump into that. Is how do you, as someone who takes Genesis literally but believes in evolution, how do you square the fact that in Genesis, everything is out of order in terms of how it should have happened? So there are plants before there's sunlight, that sort of a thing. How do you make sense of that?
Well, the one thing, now the 7 days of creation is interesting because, and it's going to be hard to get into the intricacies of all of this, but one thing is that even back when a lot of atheists like Nietzsche and others believed that the universe was eternal or cyclical or had slowly been phased into existence, the Bible had specifically said that it started at a specific time. And Christians, the Christian teaching, the official Christian teaching was that God spoke and the universe came into existence at a specific point. And interestingly enough, the Christians, it was a Catholic priest named Georges Lemaitre who actually came up with the Big Bang Theory, and who said, and this completely seems simpatico, completely validates the the Christian was in the Bible about it starting at a specific point. The universe did start at a specific time. It's not a thing that's always been there, as Nietzsche used to believe. It was a specific point. And it's so interesting because Christians do not seem to want to accept the idea of the Big Bang. It seems like there's this weird tension where Christians are completely at odds with science and they do not want to agree with science. And I think they feel it encroaches on their worldview, and that it's going to that because of the fact that so many scientists identify as atheists, they feel that, this is people's religion is the most important thing to them, and so they feel that science is a threat. The other thing I'll say real quick about Genesis is everyone's like, well, Adam and Eve are the first two humans. How can it possibly be that? How can natural selection be compatible with the story of Adam and Eve? But the interesting thing about the story of Adam and Eve is that in Genesis they have two kids. They have Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel. It's the first murder. They talk about it being the first murder. And then God says that Cain has to wander the earth. But then Cain says, no, there's all these violent savages. There's these vicious people who are going to kill me. And so God says, I'll put the mark of Cain on you to protect you. And so who are all these other people? Who are these other people who are going to hurt Cain? Some Christians say, well, Adam and Eve had other children. But that's not true, because the order that they had their children is documented right in the Bible, right in that same passage of Genesis. It was Cain, and then it was Abel, and then it was Seth. And Seth is their third child. And Seth was born well after Cain's punishment, because it says later in Genesis, it says Eve gave birth to a son and named him Seth. And Eve says, God has granted me another child to take the place of Abel because Cain killed him. So that specifically rules out the idea that these other people were the children of Adam and Eve. So who are those other people? I think the theory of evolution is implicit in Genesis, because there's the answer, I think, is, and maybe this is just me trying to make sense of my belief system, trying to fit this in, shoehorn it into the theory of evolution. But it seems to me it's implicit, because there's all these other people. To me, it must be that Adam and Eve are the first two Homo sapiens to be sufficiently complex, to be, what we would refer to as a fully developed human consciousness or a human soul. I'm thinking the scene in Kubrick's 2001 AD where the depiction of the first human who smashes the bone, symbolizing the first use of technology. But that's what I think Adam and Eve is about, is the first humans with sufficiently complex consciousness. It's telling the story of these first two humans and their children. And there's these remnants of the primitive populations who still coexisted alongside Adam and Eve. But it's implicit in the story, because Moses, who was the author of Genesis, didn't suddenly forget that there were only supposed to be four people in his story. He's writing, it's all in the same chapter. He's talking about there's these other people coexisting with them. And so the theory of hominid precursors in the human race is implicit in that passage, I think. But I don't know, that's my theory. Maybe I'm just desperately trying to make sense of the Bible. But there's so many things in the Bible.
Just to give you my view on Genesis. I mean, this is just, again, the atheist perspective. But my view is everything in Genesis makes sense as a story, and it's all perfect as it is. As soon as you stop trying to make literal sense of it, and you realize it was written by nomadic people, it was oral tradition for probably a very long time. Moses, most scholars agree, wasn't a real person. It was just, eventually written down by somebody. Like all, cultures, they just, they weren't sophisticated. They had no science for, another couple thousand years. So they just did the best they could with the stories to explain the things around them that were all chaotic and crazy. They read God into everything. And the story is kind of beautiful on its own terms in that respect. And it says a lot about the local people who lived there at the time with their very, very limited knowledge. But I mean, in my mind, the thing just doesn't make any sense at all as soon as you try to read any literary or literal elements into it. That's my perspective. I mean, I don't think there was a literal Adam and Eve. I don't think there was a serpent. I think it's a nice story that says a lot about the nomadic illiterate people that lived there at the time. But that to me is kind of like the long and short of it.
And I think intelligent people can look at the Bible like that. And obviously some of my heroes are atheists. I mean, there's scientists and writers, musicians, filmmakers I love who are all atheists. But I think there is like a danger right now in the Christian community because of the fact that I think the fact that they're not taking the Bible literally is problematic, because one of the things that Aubrey de Grey said, who's, I guess, kind of some people perceive him as a transhumanist. Obviously, he has done a bunch of research into life extension, biotechnology. He said he actually had an easier time dealing with Christians than he had dealing with some atheists, because he said that when he was trying to, convince people that life extension was a valid thing to invest in, or was something ethically valid to pursue. And he said that the benefit of Christians, of dealing with Christians, is that they have everything written down. That it's like that their code of ethics and their ideology is all written down in a book. So it's set in stone. Whereas other people's ideologies are maybe a bit more slippery.
That is interesting, although I actually totally disagree with that. Do you want to quickly hear my thought on that?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, this is my perspective. There's a book, but the book says a ton of things. Almost all of it is scrapped, and different societies at different times scrap different things and hold on to other things. I mean, slavery is all in there. Stoning homosexuals is in there. Stone a woman who looks at a man wrong is in there. Jesus comes along, sort of kind of reforms things, but never says don't do any of those things. There's still slavery in the New Testament times. He never says don't own people. That's not good. So, a lot of early Christians were super pro-slavery. Nowadays, no Christian would ever be pro-slavery, even though you could definitely, easily use the Bible to justify slavery. It's just anathema to even consider that, so Christians don't, but they very well could, Things like that, there's a book, but you interpret it as your culture, So, what's okay versus what's not okay, the modern culture determines that, not Christianity, and they kind of reverse engineer to make it look like Christianity got there first, whereas usually it's progressive people fighting against tradition who came up with modern morality, the things we just take for granted right now.
I think that there's definitely, people are candy coat the Bible, and they're like, no, there's not all this horrible atrocity. Because I know in the podcast, one of the guys was saying, when I was reading the Bible, I think he said he was a Christian as a kid, and that as he was reading it, he started realizing he was reading the most atrocious horror story ever written. Was that you who said that, or was that the other guy?
Probably the other guy. I actually, when I first read through the Bible, I was enamored by it. I read it through twice through. I think both times I'm just enamored.
There's some truth to that, because the Bible is filled with horror, but it's also because life is filled with horror. But I think that I talk to a lot of people who say, well, the Bible in the Old Testament is filled with war, and that people are being slaughtered, and God's allowing them to be slaughtered, and there's all these even prefiguring the Crusades or whatever. There's people fighting and killing, wiping out entire tribes, and that religion has led to war. And the way I look at it, and it's because I have a very the way I look at it is that yes, horrible things happened and people were killed in the name of religion, but those people now would be dead anyways, and religion at least gives the sense that those people, at least religion fights for the idea that those people are still, their souls still live on, and that they will be resurrected someday. And to me, that is I say, nature is truer than people or religion. Everyone that made it out of, they made it through a war without being killed, tribes that were able to live in peace that weren't slaughtered, those people were all died anyways, because death is the ultimate enemy. Like the Bible says, death is the last enemy.
I mean, although, if God wanted to, he could have just not had death, too. That's interesting to me, is if there was a God, he was all-powerful, There's kind of no reason why you couldn't build your story that is life with consciousnesses, populate a thing that you create with consciousnesses, and just have them like, there is some limit set to how much we suffer, because then we die. At some level we just die, and our nerve endings can only tap out at some. They only take in so much pain metrics or whatever. So there's like an upper limit to what we can experience. Like, why not have that limit way less bad? Or why not just make life so that the concept of human ownership, like slavery, just never comes into existence? Or, if you were like the almighty creator, you could tweak the dials so that things were just kind of like, this was heaven. Like, why not just create heaven? You know what I mean? And I know that's not my reason why I'm not a Christian, but a lot of people like struggle with that. It's like, wait, if God's like all good and all loving and all knowing and all powerful, why go through this like horrible atrocity? Like, life is hard and it's horrible. Why even do it? There's no reason other than like God maybe kind of has a sadistic side. Because otherwise, like, you just would.
Well,
like,
I think that's one of the biggest questions, and I agree with you completely. I mean, life is a nightmare. This existence is a nightmare, but I think that's one of the things that's one of the biggest mysteries of life, and that's central to Christianity, is this idea that everything is messed up, the world is completely messed up, but then the Bible is constantly talking about like how heaven, everything is perfect in heaven. But there's this dual track where we're trying to make the world on earth as it is in heaven. We're trying to make the real world, the like Aristotelian reality that we experience every day. We're trying to have that match the Platonic reality that the Bible describes.
Do you think at some level, though, it's not on humans, it's on God to create that? Like, you know what I mean?
Well, that's pertinent to this discussion of transhumanism, because so many of the Christians who are against transhumanism are like, no, God's going to be the one who's going to resurrect humans.
Yeah, exactly.
We shouldn't be messing around with this. We shouldn't be trying to resurrect the dead. It's going to be God who's going to do it. But I agree completely. I mean, I think I agree completely with you, is that I think we basically agree on the idea of transhumanism, that this is the right thing to do for society. That God doesn't do, for whatever reason, the world is set up the way it is. God works through humans to make things happen. And that's why the Bible calls for people to like heal the sick, and it even specifically calls for Christians to raise the dead. And so that's the thing, is I think God helps those who help themselves. We should be, trying to extend life, trying to defeat death, trying to raise the dead. That's the thing, is we are trying to make the Bible constantly is talking about the kingdom of God. It starts out like a mustard seed and spreads. And like in Isaiah 14:12, it says that the one who dies at like 80 years old will be thought of as a child. So it talks about how eventually people will live longer. And then later on in Revelation, it talks about people living forever. And so it seems like something that's imperfect. It's not like God snapping his fingers and making the world perfect, but it seems like an imperfect process where he's working through human hands to make this happen. And I think that's it. I mean, I think that's why transhumanism, why Christians have to, if they're serious about this, they have to embrace transhumanism. And I think it's interesting, you being a Satanist transhumanist, because it's interesting, because I always think of like when I listen to like heavy metal music or something that's made by Satanists, it seems like there's an embrace of death. But you seem to perceive it differently. You seem like you're opposed to death, and so like how does that intersect with Satanism? Like, do most Satanists like think death is a good thing? Do most of them think that we should try to defeat death? I mention that because I saw an interview with Anton LaVey back in it's on the Joe Pine show from the 1960s, where Anton LaVey talks about how he wants to be cryogenically frozen. And I'm thinking, well, this is an interesting. Yeah, this is like an early example of someone talking about transhumanist concepts, and the audience and the host are making fun of him for saying this, but he's like, no, I'm very serious. I think death is a terrible thing, and so is that commonplace amongst most Satanists to be against death, or what's kind of the consensus view on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I mean, it's very complicated just because there are so many different flavors of Satanism. Like Anton LaVey's Satanism is quite a bit different from the Satanic Temple. Satanic Temple has a lot of press these days because they have like a legal wing where they make a lot of noise with trying to put their satanic tenets on court buildings over, they say, like, if you have a right to put the 10 Commandments on your court building, we can also put the fundamental tenets of Satanism. So they have a lot of press. So they're kind of like the big, loud satanic branch nowadays. There are just other folks who call themselves Satanists. But, I did just pull up the Satanic Temple's fundamental tenets. They have 7 of them. And one is one's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will. That sounds pretty like transhumanist-y, Another one is belief should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world. One should take care never to distort scientific fact to fit one's beliefs. So they're very pro-science, which makes me also think that they're, pretty closely aligned with what transhumanism might prescribe. I've never seen any sort of like Satanist polling ever anyway, but that would be fascinating to know. I'm with you. I'd be very curious to know because the aesthetically Satanism is very like kind of death-y, which is kind of like anti-transhumanist. So yeah, that's a great question. I would actually love to know that poll.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. I mean, that's the perception I get when I listen to like a band like Dissection or Gorgoroth or something. There's like many Satanist artists. I love, like Kenneth Anger. I love, like, Kenneth Anger is one of my favorite filmmakers, and there's very intelligent people in the world of Satanism, and I think a lot of them are kind of maybe atheists who are kind of, like you mentioned earlier, like the aesthetics are very appealing. Satanists have the best fashion. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Yeah,
Satanism is, I think that almost without exception, Satanism is an atheist movement. I'm sure some people think Satan is a real figure and are Satanists, but by and large, it's an organization, a movement, perspective, ideology that's not a religion necessarily, and that's like not a God-fearing one for sure.
Right, and I had a drummer in a band I used to be in who called himself a theistic Satanist, and he seemed to have there seemed to be a divide between the theistic Satanists and the like Anton LaVey Satanists. Like, it seemed like there was a big divide. In fact,
I'm sure that's interesting.
Where do you fall in that divide?
I do like the Satanic Temple. I just think that they get up to a lot of fascinating things. And again, I really do just kind of align with their 7 tenets. And they're like atheist folks for sure.
The idea of the one other thing you guys were talking about in that podcast that was really interesting, and I think this is the biggest problem, has historically been the biggest problem with Christianity, has been the doctrine of hell. And the idea, so this is an area where I might agree with you. The idea of hell is extremely problematic for Christians like me. First, let me ask you, do Satanists generally accept the idea of hell? And specifically, do you accept the idea of hell on any level?
No, just in the sense that I feel like when I die, barring any sort of, weird, resurrection and with some like technology that I find that very hard to believe that's going to happen anytime soon, if ever, unless like our brains are first digitized and then maybe we're brought back in some sense, but there's a massive bandwidth issue with that. And also, I don't think cryonics is going to work anytime soon. I think that right now they're just kind of like needlessly freezing meat. But, if hell existed, it would be kind of like a Black Mirror thing in my mind, where I don't know if you've ever seen like some of those Black Mirror episodes, but there's one where like a consciousness is created digitally, and then they're forced to like every second in Earth time is like 10,000 years in the digital space time that this consciousness lives in. So they just have to like live in this numb reality where nothing ever happens for like millions and millions and millions of years. That would be hell. That conceivably could exist in an atheist world, if we are ever able to create a digital consciousness. That's like actually a legitimate fear, as we start to move into AI. Like, what if we accidentally create a conscious being that lives in a digital world and we inadvertently torture them, which would be worse than like the biblical God like torturing people in hell, except that we would be that God torturing some consciousness. I think it's kind of like sci-fi to talk about at this point, but it is technically a real threat that we could do to some potential consciousness at some point. That would be the closest thing I would ever think of could actually really be a hell.
That's interesting. Who is it? Was it Max Moore or was it Hans Moravec or one of those guys? I think mentioned something to that same. He's like, one of them mentioned something about being worried that we might already be inadvertently torturing some some form of artificial intelligence.
It might have been Max Moore. It sounds like something he might say.
I'm sorry. What was that?
Oh, it might have been Max Moore. That kind of sounds like something he would say.
Might have been. So that's kind of what this last thing I wanted to ask about, because my perspective is that the Bible, when it talks about hell, is actually predicting an alternate future. I mean, it's a complicated subject, but when the Bible talks about hell for the first half, it's talking about Hades, where everyone goes when they die. Everyone in the Old Testament, including the saints, went down to hell, and then Christ frees them at his death in the harrowing of hell. And then after that, when it talks about hell, it's talking about Gehenna, which seems to be like a civilization level event. It's Christ talking about Israel's destruction. And then in the Revelation, it's talking about what I perceive to be a warning about the far future. Because like you say, you could create virtual hells, like we were talking about with Marquis de Sade. I wouldn't want someone like the Marquis de Sade to be in charge of a simulated environment, and so as much like Frank Tipler and David Deutsch talk about creating virtual heaven, there is also this slim possibility that humans could create virtual hell. And so that is what I think the book of Revelation is warning about when it has this very apocalyptic, discusses like the new heaven and new earth, but then on the other hand, it seems to be discussing what might be an alternate future where we create like hell on earth. And there's the paradoxical thing about humanity that you have to be warned about something to prevent it from happening. And so I think that instead of this perception that everyone we disagree with is going to hell, I don't think that's it at all. I think it's a civilization level warning about the dangers of evil taking over society. But I also think it's like an extremely slim chance that something like that could ever happen, because I think that there's too many checks and balances. There will be too many checks and balances to prevent, society from going completely off the rails.
I mean, maybe. My thought there is that, like, right now in North Korea, it seems pretty hellish. The stories you see coming out of there, that's almost a hell on earth in a sense, and we all just kind of like sit back and let it happen. It's not hell, but it seems pretty bleak up there.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at several examples of like the human race is as pessimistic in everything as I am, and as worried as I get about the future of the human race. The thing is, there is constraints that they're kind of holding everything together. The fact that we still live in a society where, like you look at the tragedy that happened last week, most people are on the same page. We value families. We want to make sure that society continues to evolve. We want to make sure that society evolves in a healthy way. And I think most people, despite like political differences and stuff, are still on the same page. Even the fact that me as a Christian and you as a Satanist, we kind of both agree we want there to be a happy ending for the human race.
Yeah.
And so despite having these political and religious differences, I still think most people are on the same page. But then there's these outliers too. But what does that concern you at all? Like, as a transhumanist, do you worry about like what if things go wrong? Because basically when you talk about transhumanism, you're talking about the idea of reprogrammable reality at the point where either through simulations or through like nanotechnology, just rewriting reality, we're basically going to have reprogrammable reality where we're going to live in a spiritual world, basically, where everything will be possible. And does that concern you that if, the wrong people are running the show, that, things could go to hell, literally?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, what concerns me about the future is just kind of the unknown of it, because, if you look at like science fiction novels or movies in the 1970s, no one really predicted the internet and the troubles we would have with it, with like misinformation and that sort of a thing. And the internet just happened so quickly. And I think that we're going to stumble into technologies that we don't even necessarily have on the radar right now. And this is something that Nick Bostrom talks about, that he has this analogy of an urn where it's full of gray balls, black balls, and white balls. And every time we create a new technology, we reach into the urn, we pull it out. It's either a white ball, which means that it's overall beneficial. It's a gray ball, which means this new technology has benefits and negatives, or it's a black ball, which has unknown consequences that are overall bad. And so nuclear weapons were like kind of a gray ball. And a lot of people thought that it might be a black ball, because some physicists back in the day thought if you detonate one of these, it might suck all the air out of the planet Earth and we would all die. Like some people thought that. Well, what if that had happened? Some physicists literally thought that would happen. What if that had happened? There are going to be technologies like that we just invent, and maybe some weird lab in MIT right now, they're creating some equivalent of that they're going to press a button and it's going to suck all the air out of the planet Earth. You know what I mean? Like, we just don't, there's so many unknowns, and life is pretty fragile. So I'm kind of worried about just like that fact of we have no idea what we're getting into every time we create a new technology, and technology is like speeding forward at a crazy pace right now, which I'm all in favor of in general. But like one more thing is just like an actual worry of mine is AI and military weapons. I think that's pretty terrifying as a thing that Elon Musk and other folks have highlighted as a thing we really need to talk about more, and we kind of never do. It's almost weird how infrequently we talk about AI and military weapons, but that's a genuine scary thing in my mind.
Things definitely things could go wrong. And so we've got to watch it carefully. And, the people saying we can't develop technology because there's this slight chance that the technology could be misused.
Right.
You were talking about the Black Mirror scenario. So do you feel that there is a room for these people who are suspicious about the use of technology, the anti-transhumanists, the people that say that we're opening Pandora's box? Do you think there is a place for them, that it is good that we have some people warning about the potential dangers of technology?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely think that is a good thing by and large. But I mean, if you look back throughout history, every time there was a big leap forward, technologically speaking, there always were people, Luddites or whoever, who were for economic or for practical reasons or religious reasons were against the technology. I can't think of any examples of when they won out. I mean, technology always kind of presses forward, and the thing is, if CRISPR or some sort of gene therapy, if it's not taken up by the U.S., let's say, because we have a large anti-transhumanist movement here, I mean, it's going to be taken up by folks in China or Russia or some other country like that's technologically advanced. So, I mean, I do think that if there is something that is enticing to transhumanist types or just, pro-technology people, it's going to be developed. And I think that is the worry that a lot of it, I mean, the U.S. is always going to have fairly tight regulations on things, because that's just how we roll in general. We are pretty conservative about rolling out new technologies. I don't know if you can say the same thing about other countries or, just independent actors. Like, I will note again that there is Josiah Zahner in Austin, Texas. He, has his own like biohacking kits that you can go on his website and buy a biohacking kit for $100. And who knows, whose hands those end up in. They're totally safe. It's completely innocuous. But, what if there's a black pill Josiah Zahner someplace out there who's selling more nefarious kits? That's always a possibility.
Right. Yeah, and I think what you said is a really good point about the fact that the anti-tech voices, the anti-technology voices I can't think of any instance either where they've turned out to be right. I think it's absolutely true that there's never been an example of technological advancement that has gone wrong. You could say the atom bomb. People could say, well, look at the atomic bomb, look at the destruction at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But even that, the fact that the atomic bombs was developed and then proliferated so that every country, many countries were able to access that technology, has prevented it from being used again, because of this concept of mutual destruction. The fact that that technology was proliferated has ensured that the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has never happened again. And so even technologies that seem destructive or that seem dangerous, ultimately, and there does need to be safeguards. There does need to be these checks and balances to make sure that things don't end up in the wrong hands and that the right people are controlling the technology. But what do you think about this concept? You seem more libertarian in your views. What do you think about this? Do you think that there should be like a top-down, more centralized controlling of transhumanist technology, or do you think it should be more of a libertarian, like everyone has access to it, everyone can control their own little corner of the metaverse or whatever? How do you think that will play out?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it really depends on what the it there is, because transhumanism it's such a big umbrella term. In general, I mean, I am kind of in favor of having regulations on things that can go beyond harming a specific individual. So if you want to like implant a chip into your hand or something to that effect, that's totally fine. I would say go for it, and I don't think that needs to be regulated too highly. But if if you want to start injecting yourself with various like biotech experimental technologies that it might change the gene pool, for example, which that is like technically possible, that you could change your DNA in some sense so that it changes your germline. That all of a sudden might have like really crazy complicated implications for all of humanity. I don't know if that's technology that like someone outside of maybe like George Church's lab could necessarily do. I think that is probably where I would want to take a harder look at any given technology. And maybe I just will have one more thought there, is that if there's a technology that we have really stamped down on, I do think it is kind of biotech, now that I think about it a little bit, in the sense that, there is a way to create smallpox in a lab, and probably several hundred or several thousand labs in the world could do it. And I think that there's a strong case to, if that information still exists online, like that information should be taken offline so that people can't access it. Or, because eventually, apparently, I've heard that, it takes a high-powered lab with a lot of money to create like smallpox now. But eventually, just a high school lab will be able to print out something like a smallpox virus, because they'll be able to do that, like print anything. That technology is just rapidly developing. And we're going to have a lot of safeguards around that, so that, someone in their basement doesn't print out the world's worst version of, Ebola, for example. But in general, I think that you are right, that I am in general fairly libertarian about technologies and implementing them unless they do potentially harm others.
Yeah, and I agree somewhat. I agree. I mean, I'm a conservative, so I have a libertarian side. But although, as you look forward and you see the different technologies coming up, it seems more important than ever that we have the different institutions, and that we continue to have, because on my side of the aisle right now, there's this entirely anti-institution vibe that's coming, that was basically came along with Trumpism, this idea that they're anti-FBI, anti-CIA, anti-CDC, and where they're just deconstructing the institutions, kind of using conspiracy theories to discredit the different institutions. But like going forward, like I'm thinking like millions of years in the future, and I'm thinking of virtual reality scenarios and like the simulations, nested simulations, and I'm thinking how is that going to be regulated?
Right.
And going back to the idea of hell, we're talking about this idea of what if the technology is misused? People saying we can't develop technology because it's a slight chance it could be misused. And people say, well, you're having this discussion about hell and my claim that the Bible might be saying that the hell of Revelation, the lake of fire, might be a warning about a technologically advanced society where evil is in control. So, some people say if there's even the slightest chance of creating hell, why would we want to develop this technology? And again, I can kind of answer that with what I've learned from Christianity, because Christianity has this inbuilt response to that argument. And the argument is that, because Christianity has taught me that people should go forward in faith, millions of Christians believe that if you're not saved, you will go to hell, and you'll burn forever. You'll be tortured in the flames of hell for eternity. And yet these same Christians continue to have kids with the knowledge that there's a 50-50 chance that their kids will end up in hell. That's always been really interesting to me. I've never understood that, how some Christians I know, like homeschooling families, can breed like rabbits, and they have all these kids, but I'm like, aren't you afraid that your kids are going to go to hell? It's like you're creating these little creatures that you fall in love with, but there's this 50-50 chance they're going to end up in hell.
I have a theory that no Christian actually takes hell seriously. I don't think anybody literally does, because if you imagine that you would, like, any given human soul could burn in hellfire literally for eternity, that we're lucky to live 80 years. Imagine 80 years of even eternal bliss compared to an eternity in hell. There's no way that life the balance sheet never works out there. So I mean, I think it's an incomprehensible and kind of absurd claim that hell even exists. And just the way I can't make sense of it, I don't think Christians literally take it that seriously, even if they mouth the words that yes, they believe in hell. I have a hard time believing they really truly believe in that vision of it.
Right, because it's hard for me to believe that they would be having kids when there's this chance that these kids that they love are going to end up burning forever in the lake of fire.
Exactly, especially nowadays when
kids would seem impossible. Like that seems like a real erection killer.
Yeah, especially now when I mean, I forget the stat, but it was like over 1/3 of children, even in like evangelical Christian households, become atheists, like from the millennial generation. So yeah, 1/3 of your children are going to like burn in hell forever. I feel like that's not a great bargain.
Right, and see, that's something I've never understood, but in the context of transhumanism, I almost think that now I kind of understand, because as I explained earlier, I believe that hell, the references to hell in the New Testament, the majority of references are from the word Gehenna, which seems to be a societal level hell. Revelation seems to be talking about a potential future where, evil leads to hell. And so what I think is that, the Bible is warning about the danger of hell. Now, the Old Testament hell is different. That's Hades or Sheol, and that is talking about something that was ended when Christ came to earth, when they talk about the harrowing of hell in the New Testament. But Revelation seems to be talking about a societal level hell that I think could be predicting, if things go, if there's apocalyptic scenarios that play out, and it's a warning about the dangers of technology, transhumanism in the wrong hands. But I think that the thing that's interesting is Christians would never stop having kids because there was this chance that their kids would go to hell. And similarly, society should not stop developing technology because there's this tiny, infinitesimally small chance that technology will be misused. So again, what I learned from Christianity is that faith is important. You move forward in faith. And the families that had children, they had their children ultimately, they had faith. They had faith that everything would work out. Like you say, I don't think they really seriously, literally believed in hell. But they had faith that everything would work out, and thank God they did, because, they had to keep the human race going. We had to keep the human race going to get to this point. So anyways, that would be another example of where Christianity has taught me, you move forward in faith. And I think that, what does, to you, this idea of faith, as you as an atheist, what is your perspective on that? Should we have blind faith, or should we, how do you think that, is the idea of faith something useful, or is that something that as an atheist you don't pay much attention to?
Yeah, in my view, it's actually, the idea of faith is actually kind of counter to what I think is even relevant to the discussion, because I think that, the idea that for faith to be relevant, there has to be some power outside of humanity, some other power, some God figure to have your faith in, right? And since I don't think that there is any other higher power, or if there is, I see no evidence of it, I don't have anything to have faith in. And so I think that is to me a good perspective, because that prompts me to take action on my own behalf, not be like, oh, I have this really weird illness, I don't know what's going on, I'm going to pray about it and have faith that God's going to heal it because God loves me. I'm going to be like, oh, I have this really weird illness, I'm going to go to the doctor and see what he says, because maybe in a sense you could say that you have faith in the medical institutions, that they have that knowledge, but I think that by and large, the medical institutions have shown that they, can cure diseases more often than not, especially more often than people left to their own devices. So that certainly isn't a blind faith, even if you call that a type of faith. I do think that, even atheists have some sense of, and maybe you just call it like a sense of hopefulness, that maybe things will work out. If they don't, that'll be okay too. A little bit of that, I think that's also just a psychologically healthy perspective. I'm a very optimistic person, so if you want to call that maybe a different term for faith is optimism, I'm totally on board with that.
That's interesting. I see we just have 7 minutes left here, so I'll follow up on that real quick. Maybe perhaps what I'm saying is faith in your context, as someone who doesn't believe in God, would it be something like looking back at human history and saying it has moved and everything is moving upwards, like the human race has gotten more ethical, more technologically advanced, and more integrated on these different levels, and then looking forward and saying that trend will continue, because the naysayers and the people who are against technology paint these pictures of apocalyptic futures. And like Peter Thiel said, films are almost, Hollywood presents films where it's almost always presenting a dystopia, a technological dystopia, where technology goes wrong. So that's the complete opposite of the way reality is. So do you think that, I guess if you don't have faith in God, do you have faith in the human race, or in...
Yeah, no, I actually kind of do. And so when you look at the human animal, humans are just we love community. There are definitely some Ted Kaczynski types out there who don't, but by and large, we're here. We've made it this far in the planet just because we like community, and we like bonding together, and we like being together. And I think that if we really lean into that side of ourselves, we will ultimately be okay, at least in terms of not destroying each other. But I think that if we lean into the other side of ourselves, which also does exist, of being very tribal and being very competitive to no end, that's kind of like a also deeply ingrained in us, and is always there. But I think that we are becoming more compassionate, more open to outsiders. no matter what technology comes along, even if we merge with machines, let's say, I think that we're always going to have that part of ourselves. One more thing about like you mentioned Peter Thiel and how everything's a dystopia in terms of media, and I think that the main reason for that, and I'm as someone who's written a number of screenplays and I've written some novels, that sort of thing, take any screenwriting class and they tell you take a character and then how you have a good film is make the worst things possible happen to him. 10 minutes into the film, their life goes to hell, and then they go further and further and further into hell, and then get them out of hell somehow. That's your film, that's your book, So if you have a theme of technology, well, it's got to go wrong, or you're literally not gonna have a movie. So I think that's interesting, and definitely there are some like important warnings there that crop up from watching movies and reading books that have technology as a theme.
It's funny. There's a kind of strange kind of agreement between the conspiracy theorists who say, like that Stephen Quayle article where it says transhumanism is opening the gates of hell. Well, I mean, we're warning about that too. Even those of us who are transhumanists and who are completely in favor of it are still saying, yeah, but things could go wrong, so we have to watch it carefully. But again, I think it's so unlikely that things will go wrong because if you look at the arc of human history, everything has gotten so dramatic. Everything has moved in the right direction. And you can't just look at a person's lifetime. You have to just if you look at the last 2,000 years, how dramatically the human race has improved and how dramatically technology has improved our condition. By every possible metric, everything has gotten better thanks to technology.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm totally an optimist with that stuff. Totally agree. My one thing is that I do kind of like having safeguards, which is why I like Elon Musk's idea of becoming multiplanetary species sooner rather than later. I think it's kind of inevitable, but we're at a window in human history when we can actually do it right now, or potentially. And I think that we should, just because in my atheist worldview, the highest value, the highest moral value is consciousness, and that's the thing that we want to preserve, no matter what. And I think that we're just living on one little spaceship that we call Earth right now, and I think it should be a priority to become multiplanetary and make sure that the spark of consciousness doesn't die out, even if for some weird reason planet Earth doesn't make it into the next century.
Yeah, I agree completely. And that's probably a good place to wrap it up. Thanks again, Peter. That was a very interesting conversation.